Hey, Anders.
Hey, Tim. I think I was early.
1 minute.
Yeah. I don't use Zoom that much during a week, so I find I sometimes get into trouble if I don't join early. A lot of updates and stuff I need to get through.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Hello.
Hey, Stefan.
Hi, Stefan. Hello, everyone.
Hey, all.
Hello.
So I think we're missing Alexis and Wim. So once they come in, they can get started.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Happy Monday.
Hello.
Good morning, Alexis.
I don't know if there is more people that we're expecting. Else, we can just get started.
I think Wim said that he was on a train, so he would try to call in as soon as he could or so.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't think we should.
No, we start.
I can try to ping him.
No, he'll move in, Alexis. Go ahead, get started. You're fine.
Okay, good. Thanks, Tim. All right. Look, hey everyone. This is an informal meeting to discuss the Creator Cloud Node Cluster template user story low-level design. And it's a follow-up call to some of the calls we had in the working group 2. The intention is that in the next 2 hours, we're able to firm out a little bit the details and basically identify the low-level design to execute on. I think that's the intention, right? So with that, any other expectations, folks, from the meeting today? I think that's mainly it. Cool. So Stefan, I know you had prepared a quite extensive document. It would be great if you can get us through it. I apologize. I didn't have the time to look to all of the updates. So if you can, get us through it, that would be ideal.
Yeah, sure. I will do that just a moment here.
Thank you very much. And we have a 2-hour block reserved. We'll see what we need. If we're able to convert faster, that's great. I'm not sure we will, but I'm just putting a disclaimer that if we don't use the 2 hours, that's fine.
Okay, now I have got the latest version of it. So just a moment, I will share.
How do you want to go for note taking? Do you want me to capture note in the working group 2 meeting page, Stefan, or?
Yeah,
Because I haven't been capturing notes so far on this, but I feel
we can do
I'd
that.
rather.
Yeah.
Okay. Tim, are you okay if I use your page for note capturing today?
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. Give me one moment so I get
Yeah.
ready.
Okay, so we have. No, I see Wim also and Isti, so welcome.
Yeah, I'm in the
Right.
car.
Yeah, okay.
It will
I
be
don't know
noisy.
if you will be able to see my screen then, but I will have to. I can try to describe it for you. Can you see the screen I'm sharing now with the presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good.
Can you share? Sorry, can you just start by sharing that link if you don't mind? You probably did already share it 10 times before, but at least I'm just gonna have it.
Yeah.
In the agenda.
So it's still this Ericsson updates one, right? We haven't promoted it to the. So
Yeah,
this was the
that's
original one. So I put it as Ericsson updates now. So
that's fine.
Yeah. Copy link.
Thank you. This is just to keep it on the record.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, then we can start. I don't know how much we need to recap. We have gone through some of these slides before. This is the high level, aiming to have like a separation between the FOCOM and FO parts and the IMS parts. One of them can be implemented using our Nephew architecture, or if we want potentially both can be implemented using Nephew. So I mean that is what we have been trying to describe now then in this user story then in the component architecture. So potentially, okay, what would be the impact if you use Nephew for the FOCOM and FO parts, and also what would be the impact if you use Nephew for implementing the IMS parts, and we shall integrate over the IMS interface. So the latest I added that we have in most recent discussions upon now then is the more detailed nature of the IMS interface. So before we go to that, I just wanted to remind everyone of this picture that we have taken of them from the ORAN work group 6 recent work done in the provisioning working group, where they have identified this need for an OCloud cluster template. And I think this is quite important now then when we talk about like this division between an IMS side and an SMO FOCOM and FO side. If we shall follow this then from ORAN, the template on the OCloud side will be the master template, so to say. This will be the one that you need to define, as I said, first. This is the one that contains all the actual cluster template artifacts that are specific for a particular OCloud implementation. Like we know that in Red Hat case, we have like site config YAML files and policy YAM templates referred there and so on. In Ericsson, in our implementation in OMC, we have configuration templates that are also internal. But the idea here is that there shall be a common part that is still exposed towards the SMO, while those cluster template artifacts then that are internal would not be visible to the SMO. So for instance, if we have an implementation down here with implementing something using copy, for instance, that would be an internal artifact, those copy manifests, while some other parts here then should still be external and exposed to up to the SMO. And then on the SMO side, you will have something that is not really well defined, I would say, I mean, all this is stage 1 still, right, in ORAN. So it's some sort of a table where you have template entries then, referring to each of the templates that SMO is aware of. And they can be then in different OClouds. So there you have some of them available on OCloud X, some of them available on OCloud Y. That is something that SMO would need to keep track of then. And then what will be exposed here is a number of characteristics and metadata belonging to these templates. So that is the thing that you need to be able to fetch from this catalog on the OCloud side, and then expose up northbound then towards like RApps or other clients then that Focom will support then on the SMO side. And then more than that has not yet been identified in ORAN. So for instance, one thing that we think we are lacking here, we have discussed, is the way you are providing instance-specific input data. There is no defined format for how you, like for instance, how you in the template catalog tell which input data that is required, for instance. Like if you have a multi-node cluster, number of nodes could be such a thing. I mean, IP addressing that are like external public IPs that would be relevant to configure for your cluster. All those things should typically go into instance-specific data. So we have a discussion that we need to also work with that in ORAN as well. I mean, I have seen that is a part of like ORAN backlog work to also identify the need for such instance-specific things. I have tried to take that into account in what we have proposed here. But the key thing is that this IMS O2 provisioning interface then very much will be reduced to an interface where you refer to a template on the OCloud side where all the details exist. You provide some instance-specific information, as I said, that will be unique. And naturally, you need to provide like a target, like a site where the things shall be deployed in. And most of the other things will then be defined by the cluster template. So with that said, I have then basically...
Hey, Stefan, hang on,
yeah.
just before moving on. Thanks for resetting the context. That's good.
Yeah.
Wim has a question on the initial slide where you shared the context. Wim, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's not. It's, I mean, it's a question and maybe a statement. In Nephew, so far we defined actually two types. So that is actually two clusters defined in Nephew. To make it clear, we have the kind one is what I call, and we can discuss terminology, the raw cluster, whereas we have a workload cluster which has a bunch of bells and whistles and can include CAPI, but it's including also the surroundings around it, right? So first of all, I think we have to agree on the terminology somehow, on what cluster we are talking about. In my view, it's the one with the bells and whistles, and not the raw. And yeah, so that's basically what I wanted to, let's say, highlight or discuss, or because I think it's important to agree on the terminology there. Like CAPI kind, the way we are using it as a raw cluster. So in other words, you don't, so in my view, that's not what we are discussing in the IMS interface. We are discussing the one where we also specify, let's say, the token and the config sync and all the surroundings that we need to bring Nephew up from the beginning.
Yeah, basically it's a raw cluster versus configured cluster ready to intake workloads.
And I think it's
wait. So
just to be clear, yeah,
Alex, it's not yet to take in workloads necessarily, because in Nephew so far we brought it up enough to get something going, right? In essence, if you look to what we wanted to do in Nephew, the only thing that we wanted to apply is actually to get GitOps working, and all the rest should not have been there. That was kind of our intention. So in other words, so raw means not even GitOps is available. With the bells and whistles, maybe that's I don't have a better name right now, but it's
but it's basically
enough.
Porch, config sync, and some of the
No, Porch not even. So in other words, what we so the one that basically you can operate Nephew upon is basically get config sync up. So that's why we are, for example, adding a repo, right? Which in essence also doesn't really need to be there. If you in honest, we create a token to access the repo and stuff like that, and then we install config sync, right? So that's kind of what I call the one with the bells. So it's actually enough to get it up and running, but in other words, why is that important? I think is that the type of package we are talking about.
Yeah.
So I can comment on something here. This is also a bit of a challenge, and we really need, as to say, have the terminology clear for us here. On this picture, if you see it now, you actually have three clusters that we need to relate to. We have the workload cluster that we are aiming to deploy, as you say, that is the Nephew workload cluster. But for management clusters, we will now have two management clusters, and that is very important. That difference now, that is something that Nephew so far has not been really having to bother about. When you have like just one Nephew instance and you do everything there related to deploying the bootstrap artifacts, config sync, etc., and then deploying the network functions. But now we need to decide on really who is doing what in terms of also the two Nephew management clusters, and what are their roles, so to say, in this whole context, including this providing the initial functionality like config sync and so on. And I think that is a part of the discussion we need to have, because just looking into the way we, at least when we have had those discussions in the context of ORAN, we have seen that the NFO will be the one interacting towards like the O2 DMS interface in the cluster. That is a Kubernetes interface, but it's not meant to be a full-blown everything you want to have via Kubernetes, and it's not meant to be having admin rights. So that interface is purely there for workload deployment. So many of these things that we talk about, like initial things, Multus installation or the config sync installation and such things, it should not come from the NFO via O2 DMS. It needs to be bootstrapped in some other way. And that is so that is one part we need to discuss here onwards.
Yeah, I think we agree. We're saying pretty much the same thing. The O2 IMS is the cluster creation plus some initial configuration of the cluster, whether it's config sync, whether it's whatever kind of additional configuration to make it usable, not for workloads necessarily, but more from a overall automation picture.
Exactly.
So I think we agree. I mean, I think this is what I'm hearing from Wim and from.
Agree, but I think let's agree on the terminology, because I don't think we have yet, let's say, agreed on the terminology, right? Because for me, a raw cluster, right, is kind of what Capikind exposes. And in my view, even you can even split the raw cluster, which we didn't do in Nephew so far. Actually, we bypass it in a node pool part and in a cluster. So what you get basically is Kubernetes, raw core Kubernetes without anything else. Even you could say no CNI even, right? Because if you look to what you see with Cluster API, there is the client, the CNI, and even the storage is optional. And then my view is that the IMS one that we are talking about is what we called or coined inside of Nephew so far as the workload cluster. which basically has some bells and whistles. Very few, but enough to get Nephew bootstrapped, basically, which is you have to install a CLI, you have to install storage, and you have to install basically GitOps. Let's call it.
Yeah,
that
and
way.
I agree, but why do we need to deal? I mean, both of them are a cluster, one with more config than the other, right? And I think the intention is through the O2 IMS, the query we make is to create a cluster. Sometimes we need just, to your point, the raw cluster. Sometimes we want more the configured one. But ultimately, this is as part of the request of the create cluster in the O2 IMS. This is where we're going to specify the things we need, right? So sometimes the request will be create a cluster, and the resulting cluster is what you call the raw cluster. And sometimes the request will be create me a cluster, and the output is going to be the cluster with the bells and whistles. So I think O2
Yes,
IMS and this use case should support,
Yeah.
all of the above.
And I
The
think
reason-
that would be a
the reason-
definition in the OCloud cluster template. I mean, you could have a OCloud cluster template just for defining a raw, completely vanilla cluster. You can have an OCloud cluster template with all of the tailored functionality you want for your workload cluster.
Exactly.
The
It
re-
all boils down to the artifact, right? The definition of a cluster that we would like to provision, whether it has a, like you said, Stefan, the vanilla cluster or with some add-on services and the
Yeah.
additional capabilities that should go inside the cluster.
And the reason why it's important is because of the API. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so let's jump into the API maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
If
We take that.
sorry.
Yeah.
If you're okay, Wim, let's jump a little bit into the lower level design, and maybe that's going to help us anchor a little bit your feedback onto something tangible.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No. I just
Are you-
wanted to make it clear. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just stepping out of the taxi. It's a bit noisy. But
No problem.
but let's move on. But yeah, so I think it's important to discuss the API going forward.
Okay,
Yeah.
and I captured the feedback, Wim. It's in the doc, so it's not lost. But thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Okay. So we have talked about aiming for like a KRM CRD based interface here for the OTIMS provisioning. And what we have discussed preliminary is to capture this as something we call a cluster claim custom resource. And then we had some comments. We got those comments from you in the last meeting, Wim, whether this should be just one custom resource or if it will be divided. So far, I have seen this as just a very, very basic, simple resource that is just providing the realization of the OTIMS provisioning request. So basically, the thing you need to transfer from the FOCOM side down to the IMS in order to trigger the IMS side to do the cluster. I mean, and the key part here is this cluster template ref then, that is pointing to a cluster template package inside of the IMS management cluster. So this would be a typical Nephew workload cluster template then, a kept package that can model either a completely raw cluster with basically just a pure Kubernetes vanilla installation, or it can be something that contains everything you require tailored for an Ericsson VDU deployment with exactly the hardware BIOS settings and firmware and configuration. And if you need config sync to do the deployment, those components shall be there. You need Multus networking, those configurations shall be prepared in your template. And then you have an operator that basically clones this template in order then to create a package instance then in the management repo. And the only input data I have seen as absolutely necessary to kind of standardize in ORAN would be this site ref. We need to have an awareness because that one needs to relate to something in the OTIMS inventory infrastructure, like an OCloud site that is defined there. And then you have cluster template input data that needs to be possible to be defined as some sort of a schema inside of this template. So you would need to be able, before you do the deployment, ask, okay, for this template one, which key value parameters, which values you, or YAML structure should you provide here? And yeah, basically, I think that would be it. Perhaps you can comment on it, but I don't see that we really need much more than that, at least to start with.
Yeah, at this point, I agree as well. This is where we left it last time, and I think this is in line with where we should be so far. I don't know, Wim. I'm not sure you can see this, or other folks on the call, whether you have some comments. But
yeah, sorry, I'm trying to check in my hotel right now. See, my comment is the following, right? And it goes back to the point that I made before, is that the input data we'll have to design it to be flexible, okay? Because if you want that cluster to have more bells and whistles than just the raw thing, then you will have to have the ability to specify those bells and whistles at some point. Right?
yeah, right now
And
the
so
way
in
it's
other words,
defined is like a property bag.
Yeah.
yes, but so
Which
it's what I was basically debating about previously was the following. Like we had the same problem with when we designed our let's say our NF deployment. We had the same issue. So we started with first of all we started with something that was rather specific. Yeah? So we had one for SMF, AMF, and so on and so forth. Then we started to look at the RAN and things like that. And we wanted to have some configuration that was specific to certain deployments. And so we ended up basically having to specify various things and we had to change the API for everything that we wanted to add. And so as such, we defined like what we call a meta CR to avoid that, such that we have the flexibility to add things without having to redesign the API. And I believe this is going to be important for us.
That's the parameter ref, right?
Yes, but it's a list, right? It's not,
yes,
it's not how it is defined right now. So today it's basically a key value pair. But what I'm trying to argue is it needs to be a meta CR on which you can plug in other CRs that would be the input for potentially various attributes or various features you want that cluster to have.
Yeah, and I agree.
Yeah, so and that's the point that I wanted to make. It's not just one input; it has to be a flexible input.
Yeah. So Stefan, basically, where you have cluster template input, here would be something that we call parameter ref, and that would be an array of objects, and these objects would be meta CRs. So it would be any kind of objects that you could reference that the IMS would know how to interpret.
Look at a good example is what we did for NF deployment, right? So that's kind of, in my view, the baseline, because we did that over there.
Yeah,
I think I have an example somewhere that I can share.
But these input CRs, who will define those? Do you think that would that be something we also should then standardize in ORAN then as a part of this O2IMS provisioning interface? Which configuration snippets you can provide then as your template input?
So here is my mental model that I would like to get towards is the following. Yeah. We have a package, right? Which what you call a template, right? And the package should have an API. And maybe that API can be various APIs, right? So, and in the case of Nepio, it's a CR as the API. So it's what we call a claim. But the claim can be for a cluster, but you can potentially have multiple features. So in other words, you can have multiple claims that basically get rendered or get defined as the input, right? And so the input is actually an attribute of the package at the end of the day. So you basically specify a CR, or that's where I would like to go to. So you basically have a package. Each of the package has an input CR or a claim CR that actually defines the input that on which that package support, and that is the input that you render. So if you basically define a Red Hat package with 10,000 bells and whistles, then it's that input that is that basically is the one that gets sent down. And
but that is really what I would like to avoid. I would not like to see any Red Hat. I mean,
no, the attribute is part of the package, basically.
The attribute could be there, but it shouldn't be a Red Hat CR. It shouldn't be a Red Hat API model, right?
No.
I can explain.
Maybe the example is bad.
Yeah, we might have an example. So, Stefan, if you can open the link that. Okay, let me share.
Yeah, please.
Just to take the example that I was trying to convey last time. So that's exactly your example, Wim, okay? The NF deployment example. All right, so in OAI, when we deploy a DU, we have, you see that parameter ref. So this is all that the cluster claim will need to know. So when it's the Wind River or Red Hat cluster template, there will be a parameter ref for the Red Hat cluster template that will supply all the parameters. That's what SM or FOCOM will know. But then all the details contained for that DU NF config is actually in that NF config here. And all of that doesn't need to live in the FOCOM. That lives in the IMS. So this is Red Hat, quote unquote, recipe. So as FOCOM, you don't care, you don't even need to know about that. You will just refer to that as the provider of the config. And in this case, I will provide like three CRs, whatever. But that way, we can integrate as many objects as we want as part of the initial deployment by leveraging what we call a parameter ref and not a property bag. If all I care is property bag kind of, well, I can have something like this. As you can see, I'm passing just a property with their values, but I can also have something that is a bit more modeled, in this case, the PLMM, where I know I'm going to expect the PLMM info and so on and so forth. And I think this is exactly what you're referring to, Wim, and the update.
But the property ref, just a second. I don't care about I do not care about the pattern that you have here. I think the pattern's fine. But the information that's conveyed, remember, it's information that's conveyed from the service provider, right, to the cloud provider. All right. And so the service provider shouldn't have, again, I think that's what Stefan's talking about, would not have, as an example, information about the recipe that the cloud provider will use. But we have to make sure that, in fact, we can't make sure, but we have to understand that this information that would be passed would be information that is that the service provider would know and use in that claim for the purpose of creating the cluster, and the cluster itself, the cloud vendor will have the recipe. So if I'm trying to hide as a cloud vendor, if I'm trying to keep the actual recipe information, whether it's Red Hat or whatever, right, from the service provider, it would not be part of the claim. It's part of the cluster template recipe, right? So I just want to make sure that sometimes we're using these terms, but the understanding is that the information that gets conveyed on the claim is that which the service provider knows in order to complete the claim, not to build the cluster.
Agreed, and that's what the parameter ref represent. It's as a service provider what I need to specify, but this is not the recipe. The recipe is what this object actually holds.
But just to make it apply it to this case, so here we would instead have a parameter ref still with workload nefyorg as the API version, but it will be a kind of like a cluster config or something. We will need to create a new kind called cluster config then.
This is a meta object, so this is not even a CRD. That never makes it into the cluster.
No, but just the naming here, INF config doesn't fit, right? For
So
it's more of a naming thing, right?
Yes, this is an example to illustrate how we want this to happen.
Yeah, And
That's
here
it.
for
Exactly. You're
this
right.
kind
It wouldn't be
of,
NF config. Maybe it will
Yeah.
be workload cluster config instead.
But this one, NF config, that one is used to carry a configuration data or specify configuration data for any kind of network function. Then you could have it for.
It's completely generic. Exactly. Whether it's a Red Hat, whether Ericsson,
Yeah.
Nokia, you name it, whether it's
Yeah.
a DU, a CU, doesn't matter. It's completely agnostic.
Yeah.
So this is just the carrier of the information, but the details of what it contains is only defined in that instance. But the same shell can be used for any kind of configuration.
But now I have a question. Wouldn't it still be so in either case? The actual user initiating the cluster creation request, they will do that from Focom, right? And they will need to fill in this internals of the NF config object in order to provide the instance specific input, right?
Well, I'm not sure. I think when the cluster template will be loaded on the OCloud, it will be loaded with the appropriate parameters and definition already, right? So this is, I think your question is about, can I overwrite some of the properties when Focom makes the request? So can Focom override some of the properties? I think that's the question.
Yeah, and that is coming back. Yeah, you don't think so?
I don't think so, and I don't have the answer, but I don't think so.
Oh, but
I think
that is the key thing here. What we have seen, what is missing, as I see it in the also in the ORAN discussions right now. I mean, absolutely, you must you have a service orchestration layer on top of Focom, and that is where you take all the decisions about, okay, where will this cluster be placed, and which VPN will it be connected to, and so on. So there's a lot of configuration there that you cannot know on the OCloud side until the SMO layer has taken decisions about, okay, where shall the cluster be placed? This particular instance, the template must be generic enough to allow you to put the cluster in whatever site you want, right? And they provide the applicable parameterization.
Yeah, so okay, so in my view, right? Okay, so why is the API important? To give us flexibility. Okay. Now, how much flexibility you give is up to your use case, right? So some people want to actually have very little bit exposed. Some people want to have the full flexibility to customize every parameter on the planet, right? But we should basically define a system that allows for both, right? You see, so if you want to consume all the details, why should we be in the business of stopping of doing that, right? We should define a flexible system that people can consume the way they want, right? So we can make a very abstract view, and all the defaults are locally defined in locally on the OCloud, right? So nobody can specify and nobody can manipulate. But for other use cases, people would like to customize these parameters, and I think we need to have the flexibility to allow that.
Yeah,
right.
And I think that should work. Even we have this NF config CR, or we call it not a cluster CR, cluster config CR. If that one is provided as a part of the request, then I mean the SMO side, as I see it, would need to be able to get access to the details of that one. I think when you query for the information about a particular OCloud cluster template, you should in that case also be able to query for the NF config custom resource instance, the one you just showed. That is like specific. That one can then be very specific with all the bells and whistles if you have a complex cluster. And then the SMO client should actually be able to check this CR and then fill in any missing pieces here or modify.
But Stefan, where I disagree is if it's a Red Hat OCloud cluster or a WinRiver or VMware, it's going to be completely different kind of objects, right? So SMO doesn't want to be in the business of knowing whether it's XYZ vendor, right? So how does SMO supply, specific cluster config I mean, for me, it's defeating a bit the purpose, because then all of a sudden SMO needs to be aware of, okay, that config is for Red Hat, but this config is for VMware, right? Then that doesn't work for me. I mean, that doesn't work from an SMO standpoint. We're losing the agnosticity of the API. Whereas
that was my concern, and that is why I thought, or that is the way I understood it. But perhaps this NF config, I saw that as some sort of a generic format now. Then how you can, I mean, in this case, then how you can provide input config for any kind of NF, and you define it. You have the kind NF config. Then you define, like here, then which okay, you have an underlying. It's kind of a API version there. I haven't looked into this one enough, but you have an API version, you have a kind RON config there. So now you basically tell then for which particular vendor this config, this NF config custom resource is applicable for them. So you would need to have that understanding on your client side. And okay, now I'm populating the data that is required for an Ericsson VDU. And as I said, you should be able to get that from this this structure. I would prefer to compare it to, like in that case, you have like VNF additional params in your VNFD. Your NFVO and VNFM should be able to parse those VNF additional params and then expose, okay, these are the data that is particular for this deployment. Here you would do the same then. Check this NF config that is provided and then say that, yeah, here I need, these are all the input you need to provide for your Ericsson RAN video.
We have a couple
but
of
we have a bit of
Yeah.
a conflicting. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. Yes.
Well,
Can I maybe
let's-
ask one statement,
Go ahead,
because
Wayne.
we get a bit of conflicting. Yeah, sorry, I don't see I'm still in my mobile. So a bit of conflicting things. On one hand, we want very abstract. You don't want to know any details. And on the other hand, we say we want to customize. Somehow that doesn't go together, right? So we have to, yeah, so that's my only, so we need to be clear what we want, but I want to build a system that is not locked in one way or another.
Agreed. Hey, we're gonna Federico.
Sorry.
I think you raised hand on the chat, so go ahead, and then I think it's Alok.
No, that's all right. It was covered.
Okay.
I'm lowering the hand. Thank you.
Alok, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Alexis. So, right. So this DU deployment.yaml, I think, yeah, that's a good example to at least clarify some of the discussions which is happening currently. The parameter reference, this has the kind as NF config, and in our case, the cluster configuration, it will be something as a workload cluster config, as you said, and that will include only the vendor specific parameters, right?
Correct.
That's my understanding, at least. And then
Correct.
if you need some additional parameters, then that will be, so if you go back to that DU deployment, so then it will have another, like it's a list of parameters. So then there will be additional parameters like the IP subnet or those kind of parameters, which are more vendor agnostic, and that still be doable. Like you can still define those parameters and can have those
Agreed.
inputs from the SMO, right? Is that the correct
Agreed.
understanding?
Agreed, but then these set of parameter would have to be standardized because
Right, absolutely. That
Right,
will
okay.
go. Yep.
Agreed. Then yes, agreed. Absolutely.
So okay, so my
So what are
understanding
these
is then,
sets of parameters is the questions, right? Do we
right?
want
So
that set of parameter to be able to tune a core on a specific socket? You see, or do we
no,
want that?
that's too
That's
low level,
that's the
right? So I mean, what I'm after is like if you are asking SMO to provide, let's say, the subnet, right? Which is vendor agnostic, right? So it just gets the IP subnet that should be assigned to a workload cluster, right? And then that could go one of the parameters. And then anything which is one platform specific could be defined inside the CR as, or the subclass or whatever we call it, inside the workload cluster config CR, right? Which is another parameter referencing the custom resource definition for that, and that includes the vendor specific parameters. At least that's how I see it.
But I'm okay. Tim, did you have your hands? I'm not. I'm bad at
Yeah,
raising.
yeah. So
Sorry.
again, I think you guys are in the weeds a bit, maybe rightfully so. But I just want to remind us that remember, you have two entities. You have the service provider and you have the cloud provider, and they've made an agreement on what they're going to pass in this cluster claim. So if they so choose between the two of them to go down to the subnet level, then that should be permitted. We don't also have to standardize. Every one of them that you want to cross there has the potential to be standardized, but I suspect that not every one of them will be standardized. The pattern still holds, whether these are I say cloud vendor specific or operator specific, right? But it's the contract and agreement that they had on the claim. For us, the basic claim probably will not have any specific information above and beyond just what's there, right? You know, maybe it will. I doubt it, but maybe it won't, right? It probably won't. So, but we're allowing the pattern for what Wim was saying is to allow the service provider and the cloud provider to decide amongst themselves what they want to pass in order to claim or create a request for a cluster such that the cloud op vendor can then fulfill that claim request. That's the point that I want to make, right? Is that we can't say, well, we're not going to do that because it's not standardized. I'm just saying, just put the pattern in place that gives them some flexibility to do these things because it's their discussions they're ultimately going to have, right?
Pattern or some sort of an optionality, right? Because I mean, we are saying that workload cluster config, that will be a sort of a CRD, right? And that will be defined within the cluster claim. Then are we saying that is something which shall be existing as a requirement within that claim, right? Because otherwise, if it's
a reference to it, right? And so it's kind of like, but the operator is going to know that reference, right? It's
but I don't see that should go as a requirement, right? So that should be an optionality. Either you can define or the
but the parameter
design.
Refs, hang on, Alok. The parameter refs are all optional. They're not required. It's just an array. You have an array of 0.
Yeah.
But
So
how does
ultimately
it work?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll look.
No, go ahead.
I'm just perhaps just try this parameter refs. When you then point to this API version kind and a name DUNF config, is it that you first create a CR then called DUNF config based on the NF config kind, and then you apply that one to the management cluster, and then you create this NF deployment CR and apply that one, and then is that the way it works with these parameter refs, or?
So, if I may, right?
Yeah, go ahead, Wim. After we have Federico on the chat.
Yeah. So the parameter. So basically, what you know, so the person that offers this as an interface should know what to do with it, right? So first of all, it's the receiver that basically decides how he consumes it, right? So that's number one. I would even advocate that the client has a way to discover them, right? So you could actually discover it on the client side if you want, right? So that's an optional thing. And then because I think we have a dream that every cloud implementation is the same, but I doubt. I've seen this tried in various industries and never succeeded. So I would like to, if we would like to have a standardized API, we can try, but it's hard. I'm telling you, because every person in the planet has different IDs. And so I would rather go for a system where you basically say, here is an API, and everybody can define its own kind, right? So we have to give some guidance. You can discover what that is, right? So that the client knows what the server supports. And then the server that offers it has an ability, I will determine the behavior based on what is specified, right? That's how far I would like to go. And that shouldn't be specified at the end of the day.
I think I agree about that. So Federico, you have your hand raised.
Yes, hi everyone, this is Federico. I actually work with Alex in Workgroup 6 for also defining the cluster templates there, and also with some of you that I see here on this call. So you're absolutely right. That's also one of the options that we're discussing, is that the Falcon will discover which templates are available on the cloud, kind of like the lookup that we saw on the first slide that it was presented. And as you mentioned, there will be some parameters that are returned with this template. Those parameters are vendor specific, meaning you can change how the instance of the cluster is deployed. So for me, a template, of course, it's a template. You have some kind of parameter that you can modify, right? And we don't want to get into the details of defining what those parameters exactly are, because if I give you an example, like for a Red Hat Cloud, you will have also, all the IP address, the BMC IP, the BMC username and password. So all of those could be just returned together with the template, and the SMO will be able to fill in this information and send it down to the NAFIO IMS cluster.
But in this case, no, then if the FOCOM, if we have this a separate, we say cluster config CR, then similar to the NF config CR you showed there, should then FOCOM first, should there be two operations then on O2IMS? Like the FOCOM designs this field in cluster config CR and applies it to IMS so that it exists there. And then it sends in this cluster claim, and there you have this parameter ref then referring to that other CR.
The parameter ref, yes, but those parameters, what you can change as part of this parameter ref CR are defined in the lookup process of the template.
So that could be something, if you look at this kind and the NF config name, DU NF config, I would think that basically you would need to have such an NF config instance available then. If we shall go this path, we need to have that one available as a part of your OCloud cluster template. In that kept package, there should be a custom resource called like a custom resource manifest file for this NF config with a particular name then, DU NF config. If it is for deploying now then a cluster tailored for a DU with some particular input data required there. And then the SMO could then query for the template and then get also then the content of what shall the NF config consist of for this particular cluster then? Is that,
But that's the thing. Yeah. NF config shouldn't be standardized. What should be standardized, or what?
I agree. Yeah.
Okay.
The NF config content cannot be standardized, but the fact that you have an NF config must be standardized. If we have these parameter refs and we want to have that parameter refs inside of the O2IMS MBI, then we must standardize that that there is something called NF config, right? That level must be.
NF
Well-
config or the workload cluster config as a
Yeah, they can
parameter
call
has
it
to
whatever.
be,
Yeah.
has to be standardized,
I'm
right?
okay, we
Otherwise,
can carry it in as a CR, but we need to standardize. We need to tell here then that this will be then, eventually it will be then the OTIMS API that must have this workload cluster config kind as a CR then.
Yeah, so NF-config, by the way, sorry to chime in, was defined, but for example, if you have Yang-based definition, it contains a Yang schema, right? So in other words, it's the Yang schema that basically determines the content of it. So you don't have to specify it because Yang defined it, right? But you could basically go for an Open API-based schema, in which case you have to define the Open API schematics for it. So you have the you should have the flexibility to consume it. What I would advocate is that your package somehow contains these. That doesn't have to be in a way that doesn't have to be actuated, but can be used as a discovery, because then the client can actually consume it and do a programmatic machine validate. You can do all kinds of stuff with it, right?
Exactly,
So
you can do that.
yeah, we can then schematically consume it through some software and stuff like that.
Yeah, but one thing there, schematically then, if you have a CR like this, you will basically provide then some sort of a like the template for this NF config, the way you require it. Can you there specify also then, okay, these are the default parameter values, these are the mandatory input, these are the optional input that needs to be provided in this this particular NF config?
In my view, yes, right? So that's what the schema allows you to do, in my view, right? So what you could do, let's take the example of Red Hat, right? They have maybe 1,000 parameters, okay?
Yeah.
But you're only interested in one, okay?
Yeah.
There will be defaults probably for all the rest, and you only care about one, and that should be a very valid way to consume it.
And I would even think that I wonder you could split it. You can have one NF config for like DU external values, or one for DU internal values, and then the external values is shown in the exposed to the SMO.
Indeed. So yeah, and then we are not prescriptive, right? And what to do, but what we define is one, so the input parameter should be schematically defined, and what that is, in my view, I mean, I would advocate for Open API because Yang has lots of challenges, but that's up to the implementation again. But it should be defined in a schematic way that we can discover, such that then we can programmatically consume it through a machine, as well as by a human.
Do you have some examples already on this, in the ones you have done now for NF config? Do you have some examples on this schematic validation?
So what we do, for example, so for Open API, you have an Open API validator, right? Which Kubernetes gives you, right? So if you basically do Open API schema, you basically can take in a validator. There is various implementations that you can use, and then you can do the validation with that. With Yang, we released a project that does that, but there is not, so it's less standardized at the moment. But the tools is, this one does that, for example. Yeah, but yeah, so.
But do I get you right now then? So if we go,
No, I would like to maybe help converge a little bit. So to recap, if we go back to this now, okay?
Yeah.
Oh, my bad. So what we're saying ultimately, and I think I want to maybe take a step into a proposal, the cluster template input here should probably become like here, a parameter ref. What we expect the parameter ref to have is an array of objects identified by API version, kind, and name. It can be one, it can be many. I think so far we agreed on that. Now what we're discussing is whether there is at least one of these objects in that parameter ref array should be defined as well. Like here it's the NF config, maybe the workload cluster config, as Alok suggested. I think this is at the level at which we are right now. Should we have at least sorry, should we have at least one element in that array that is defined and standardized? I think, is this what we're saying here?
I think
But
whatever
we
we
could,
define as a parameter has to be standardized, right? Because otherwise, how will the O2 or the SMO request those parameters? I mean, the
But
definition, I agree. I mean, this could be even the
Alexis,
specific.
I wonder if I understood you right, but I thought basically that then if we follow this approach, then this whole thing, parameter refs with an array of NF configs could be allowed then to be sent as a reference on the class in the cluster claim. And then it's just based on the template, whether the template require you to provide one such NF config, or in this case, then cluster config CR, or it's 3 or 10, right? That is something you should be able to discover from the template then.
Exactly. Sorry, I was about to make change, but I don't want to edit actually your PowerPoint. But yeah, exactly. And Alok, to your point, to your question, this is this when FOCOM discover the cluster template, it will discover what is the expected parameter refs here.
Yes.
So it's not going to SMO doesn't need to invent them. It will know about them the same way it will know about the cluster template.
Yeah.
So it's
But
it's that lookup.
But this is a claim request, right? Where the parameter reference will be defined.
Sorry, I missed the beginning.
This is the cluster claim request, similar to what you are presenting now, this du deployment.yaml. Maybe, yeah, I think this could be a good example here.
Yes, exactly. This is where I'm going to make the edit. I'll remove it after. If you're okay, Stefan, I'll just make the edit for the sake of the discussion here. Sorry, I'm struggling a bit. Oh my God. But this is how I think we're discussing to have this.
Right. And this cluster claim will be coming from SMO over O2, right? And we said, I think we agreed that whatever parameter that we define in parameter ref has to be standardized, because this will ultimately be coming from the SMO.
So we said two things. We said the vendor will supply their own parameter ref, like the server. So that's given by the IMS itself. Then what we said, and this is where we discussed, we said maybe there could be another set of a parameter here, which are maybe the ORAN standards. And in there, so that would be another parameter ref, okay? And in there would be the list of parameters such as the subnet and whatnot that would be overridable. So that's to the question that I tried to capture here. How much should FOCOM override or be able to override? And so it would be a potentially another object in that array, and that object will have to be standardized. Right now, we don't know what it will look like, but
then
if
this
we agree
NF config and workload config or workload cluster config, I mean, that becomes very specific to NFIO-based IMS cluster claim, right? Because
but this is not standardized. This is not standardized. This is part of the lookup that you discover. Okay. What would be standardized is the ORAN standard kind of parameter that might be the subnet. And sometimes nobody will use any parameter ref. Sometimes people will use the only discovered one. Sometimes people will only use the one that is overridden by SMO. So then it becomes very flexible.
And how will that be discovered, if I may ask, during onboarding process, or when will that be?
When you get to know about the cluster template, you'll get to know as well about the various parameter ref that has been onboarded to configure that cluster template specific instance. So this is already information part of the cluster template. So actually it's debatable that it's even.
If that's discoverable, I mean, that mechanism we're saying could exist, then it kind of dilutes the purpose of having standardized ORAN parameters. I can just define all my vendor specific parameters in my cluster template, and some way they will be discoverable during the onboarding process. Why do I need the ORAN standardized parameters in that scenario?
Because you don't have syntactic you don't have semantic meaning of of vendor-specific parameters, nothing that SMO can rely on, right? So that would be the ORAN standards, like parameterization's purpose, that you have a set, a well-defined semantic meaning for that, right?
The intent is to avoid FOCAM to know about each vendor semantics exactly.
But
what
we still can define in the interface, I think it would be this structure, right? That you have parameter refs. We can have an API version that is then O2IMS know something.org, and then call it cluster config kind. And then you have an array of such cluster config kind. That would be the cluster claim interface, and that you don't need to standardize anything more specific there. Then it's just what is defined inside of that cluster config instance then that will be described in the template.
Yeah, so
raise my hand. So I think
sorry, go ahead.
It's the following, right? So I think what I was advocating is build a generic system. Now we have we meaning ORAN could say, no, I want to standardize. I want to basically, like you are defining here, I want to standardize a basic set of things that I want all my vendors to rely upon, right? That is a possibility, right? So we don't exclude that necessarily, but I wanted to build a framework that gets you the flexibility, because for me, the system that I would like to build now is not necessarily only going to be consumed by O2IMS. It can be also consumed by other things, right? So if the ORAN Alliance tries to standardize a specific set of that config, that's valid, right? So I don't think we can exclude that, right? Because there are sometimes people believe that we want to standardize it. We should allow for that to happen, but we don't have to mandate it, if you see what I'm saying.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I agree. I'm on the same page.
But now we talk about the O2IMS implementation, right?
Correct. So O2IMS could basically say, I define a standard schema to do this, right? And I mean, who am I or who is Nephew to avoid that? I think Nephew should build a flexible system. That's what I'm advocating. If people want to consume it in a very specific way, that's fine. But we as Nephew should not be only doing a very specific design. We should allow for a flexible design. And if people want to consume it in a very specific way, that's a possibility. But that's what I'm trying to advocate. Okay. Sorry.
No, this is good. Thanks. Gregory, I think you have your hand raised as well.
No, I think that Wim said all right. Well, maybe one thing is that the cluster template ref is not really a thing that you need to have in this anymore. Or am I misunderstanding that like the parameter ref should also contain the cluster template ref? That is a parameter of the cluster claim as well, or?
Well, that's a good question. This is as I was drafting this, the cluster template will already know its own workload cluster config. So I'm starting thinking maybe that's not even something we want to have here. And we only want to have the things that we care for ORAN, which would be this one.
But I think what he's saying, Alexis, is that the cluster template ref, is that really a parameter ref now, where you're just pointing to a kind of a cluster template with a name, and now it becomes
okay, I see what you're saying.
Template. So it's not first class; it's a parameter ref.
Right. So here would be you're talking about having something like this. So another parameter ref that would point to this cluster template.
But I don't see what we would gain on that. I mean, if we just make things extremely abstract, we know that there should be always a cloud cluster template. I mean, that one, as I see it, that one would be always mandatory.
Because that's right. Because you're talking about O2IMS at this point. The spec is for the O2IMS guys. So
yeah. This is the spec
it's not for general
Yeah,
Nothing general.
I'm not aiming for a general cluster claim. Then we should call it something else. Then I really see this as the O2IMS provisioning interface that we easily can like promote into ORAN. And then it should be a custom resource for the O2IMS provisioning. If we call it cluster claim, it's still O2IMS. So it should not be the generic way Nephew perhaps would like to do things that is non-O2IMS.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I don't want Nephew to have another way to create clusters, right? So I know we care here about the way to create it for ORAN, which is fine, but this should also be usable outside of the ORAN scope. And that's why I think having it that way is agnostic and it's good enough, right? So for ORAN, we would have that mandatory kind of parameter list that SMO would be able to override. Whereas for other,
But your
sorry,
spec starts.
But
your
you would
spec
still
starts with
need.
O2IMS.
You cannot get away from that on the IMS side. You would need to have some logic there that follows the ORAN way of working, right? I mean, that takes the input finds the referred OCloud cluster template and I mean, identifies that package then in the Nephew example package repo and take that one to be cloning.
But so
yeah.
So my comment first of all would be to not call the API version O2IMS because it should be a Nephew infra, right?
No, but then we are talking about, then we are really discussing about completely different things here. I really thought that we should not define something for Nephew. The case, this use case is really about ORAN alignment as I see it. And we have a proposal in ORAN to make a custom resource-based interface. So this should really show how that ORAN.
Yes, but so Stefan, I mean, we are you can do whatever you want in O2IMS, but we are discussing Nephew here, right? And how to use it.
No, but this subgroup is about ORAN compliance.
So let me finish first of all, right? First of all, the fact that you are trying in O2IMS to create a cluster is for me very awkward, if I'm honest. Okay, because there is nothing specific to a RAN for a cluster that is to any other cluster, right? So we are not doing the industry any favor by doing this, okay? Because you will have to implement a gazillion implementations for no reason, okay? So I would really advocate, if you want to have something specific to O2IMS, you can have a parameter ref that is specific to what you want to do, right? But the overall framework should not be O2IMS specific. And I would be very strong against that if we do that.
But the framework could then be something below then. I mean,
so you can have a parameter.
What I am actually proposing is as an interface on top then. You could have the framework below, and then you have an O2IMS API on top with an operator, and that is calling the framework.
You can basically implement, you can define a parameter ref which is O2IMS specific, and that's it.
No, that would not be, that would not create an O2IMS compliant interface. It would create a Nephew interface with some O2IMS things inside. That is not what we want to create here. We should create an O2IMS interface that also can be implemented by a non-Nephew IMS.
Sure, and you can use the parameter ref for that.
But why should they? What API version should they use then? If you want to have something there,
so the parameter ref will. So the parameter ref will have an O2IMS specific API version. So the API version in the parameter ref will be O2IMS specific.
No, but when the cluster claim here is equivalent to the request which is coming from the SMO over O2IMS, and that has to be agnostic.
So why yes, correct. But what we are defining so far in Nephew is agnostic. So why do you care that there is O2IMS in front?
This one you're talking about?
Yes, that's the first. Let's discuss first that. We define a Nephew cluster claim. And in that, if you want to use it for O2IMS, you can have a parameter ref that is specific to O2IMS.
Well, we actually, even in the spec, have an O2IMS kind of...
Okay, so I'm first at the top, right? I'm not there yet.
Okay. Well, I don't
Yeah.
see any reason we need to keep in the API version the O2IMS specifically here.
But wait,
But
the
no,
target
yeah,
here
sorry.
should be
Let me step back.
to move this over. This
Yeah,
should
but-
be the thing we can bring to ORAN and say that, look, this is the way we would like the O2IMS interface to look like. And there basically it should be just rather nephew org shall then immediately be replaceable by oran.org, and everything else should look the same. And that is why it makes sense to have O2IMS there. And then that one, then we can then change that to ORAN. And then there is no reason to hide the cluster template ref under a parameter ref, because in ORAN we can definitely agree and know that at a minimum there should be a reference to a cluster template.
And the reason we wanted to have this O2IMS.ORAN like at the beginning with the API version, because today the information model, okay, that the discussions are in progress in ORAN, but nothing is there for the data models, right? And if we converge and come up with a agnostic proposal in Nephew, we can actually contribute back in the community, in the standards community, right? And this becomes like influencing the data models, right? In the specifications. Ultimately, that's the goal, right? Like developing pre-O2IMS interface here, since Nephew is an implementation.
But hang on. So put back. Let's just look at this for a second, guys. Right? I'm going to go with Wim on this one real quick, and I'll show you how you bring it back. Right? So if you go in and you say infra.neprio.org, just put that in there in the API version. Go ahead, Alexa. You're talking. The infra is the target. The O2IMS is simply an interface, right? And so really, what's the difference if I have an infra.nepio.org and have a custom claim kind for that, right, that's used, and then I bring it back into ORAN, maybe they make some tweaks, and they become infra.oran.org. I mean, it's still the same thing, guys. We got to be careful about, the infrastructure is the target. We're doing the infrastructure of a cloud that we're making a cluster claim. So adding the O2IMS is really just not. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? This is that information that's there. It's whether it's conveyed over an O2IMS or I'm just inputting it through a CLI. Who cares?
But today, I agree. I mean, today in the context of Nephew, I'm totally fine what you are suggesting, Tim and Wim, about calling it as nephew.org. But as soon as we position this as the API group inside the ORAN standardization, it doesn't fit there, right? Because Nephew is one specific implementation and one platform provider.
Well, I'm saying that what they'll probably do, and this is all honesty because it's standard, right? Is that they'll change that from infra.nephew.org to infra.oran.org. And they'll have a cluster claim
infra or O2IMS, right? There is nothing else.
I probably would argue that you don't stay out of the reference. Right? The target is you're doing a cluster claim for infrastructure, cloud infrastructure. Whether we call it O2IMS.
Now in the IAM spec itself, we are removing infra and making it more implicit. Like infra means O2IMS.
So they change it to that. But okay, yes. But then they're going to take the cluster claim and they're either going to use the Nephew claim as it says, or they're going to go and enhance it to what they want it to look like. And it becomes standard and no one uses it again, right? So except for the 3 vendors that have to go with that does RAN, right? Which is what Wim is arguing about, right?
But now then, we do this infra.oran.org. Then also the workload cluster configs down there. There should be a CR there also then infra.oran.org.
But what Wim is saying is that you take the O2IMS and that becomes your claim, part of your parameterization of your parameter ref, right?
Yes. So in other words, you don't even do O2IMS in there. You have a parameter ref which is O2IMS, and that's that basically specify your templates and sites and what have you, right?
Yeah.
And then you have all the flexibility on the planet. And then so the nice thing, if you do infra Nefio.org at the top, you can deploy it for any cluster, not even ORAN. And
No,
that's
no,
what
but,
we
But then
yeah,
are we saying
but
that the
that is not
cluster?
what we are after, right? We
Yeah.
are after the other way around. We are after an OTIMS interface
Yes, but
that allows you to have a
but-
non-Nefio IMS.
Stefan, you can do in ORAN whatever you want, okay? We are discussing here Nefio. So in other words, this should be the framework of the API with Nefio at the top, right? And you can have an ORAN specific. That's what we do in Nefio, right? And then if you want to change it to ORAN in ORAN, go ahead, right? And then we can use this for any cluster run, any cluster that we want. And we are not specific to the radio. And then if you want to do it in ORAN to make it ORAN, go ahead. That's
So we would add to the parameter refs, right?
yeah. In the parameter
Elected-
refs, you would use O2IMS, so those parameters should
Exactly,
go to parameter ref,
exactly,
right?
exactly. That's right, and that's what we would standardize, guys. We would
Yes.
say we're taking an Nefio in ORAN. I mean, we might change the API version, you know, because there's some sort of constraint there in ORAN. But we would just standardize the fact that you have a parameter ref called O2IMS.
Yeah, but it still doesn't fit because
I think
we are
Why?
not just standardizing the parameters in ORAN, right? We are standardizing the cluster template as a concept, and here we are
That's
using.
because forget about the fact that it's called parameter, right? You're standardizing information elements. And the information elements that you're standardizing, if you can bring it back to that piece of it, right, is the cluster template ref. Yes, is the cluster template ref and the site ref. That's what you care about in ORAN.
No, in ORAN, we
You
are
will just,
provisioning the cluster using the cluster template. And if I just pick the optional parts, which is the ORAN, the mandatory parts, which is ORAN specified, I cannot build the whole cluster using that specific API model.
Whoa. Why not?
So no, Alok, it will be defined like from an open API perspective, because you already know that in ORAN it cannot be a CRD, right? So it's going to be the open API, and the parameter refs, it's an array of objects or just an object, and how that object is defined, you know, it doesn't need to be standardized.
Yeah. Look at how we do Yang, right? So for example, in Yang, right, what we have a Yang container, right, which is API version blah, right? And you can stick any Yang file inside.
Exactly.
We didn't specify the Yang, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Yang we didn't specify because that's defined by 3GPP or by the vendor or whomever, but you have a standard way to encapsulate that data.
Because
So,
it's defined as the open
I
API.
think what the misalignment is, I think, on what we were aiming to show as a proof point here. So my proof point was, and there, what you said, Wim, you can do whatever you want on top. You can create an OTIMS interface on top if you want, and call it whatever. And actually, that was what I wanted to prove, that we can do that, and that we should have that as a part of this Nefio use case, the ORAN create cluster use case, that we show that actually we have Nefio below, and then we can provide and create the O2IMS ORAN specific interface on top. Whether that is open API based or CR based, that is a bit discussed, right? I mean, for now, we said that, yeah, we should actually show that as a CRD-based interface, because that is like the proposal from Alexis, right? But now I feel that we are aiming for what we're talking about is the underlying generic Nefio engine in order to be able to support a lot of northbound interfaces then, including like the O2IMS interface.
Yeah, yeah, correct. Yeah, I think because we even have to enhance our workload cluster in Nefio, right? Because today it is, I think there are some improvements to be done, right? So we want to basically hit two birds in one stone and not do something we should build a framework that can be generic, that covers various scenarios. And that's one, and then you can build on top however you want to consume it, right? Because if we build something very specific to AutoIMS, we cannot use it anywhere else.
No, that was actually, yeah, where I was coming. I was. It's more like what you start with, right? I mean, my starting point was that we begin with, okay, assuming that you have an AutoIMS interface, you would like to provide that as the standard ORAN AutoIMS interface. It is CRD based. What would you need to build below that in order to fulfill it? And I think that is where we have jumped now. But we have so far, the concern I have is that we have right now not really agreed and defined on how we would like that ORAN standard AutoIMS interface to look like. Now we make assumptions and we try to optimize something where we then do something nice and generic in Nephew that could support both AutoIMS and other things. But the concern I have is that before we actually have agreed on how the AutoIMS interface as such will look like, we might deviate in the wrong direction here.
Yeah, but I think, Stefan, I'm of the opinion that you cannot build a house unless you have a foundation right? So you first need to have the foundation right before you can build the next layer.
Yeah,
right?
I was coming from the other, yeah.
If you do it the other way around,
I was coming from the other direction, actually. I think I realize that now. Because I was really coming from that we should handshake on how this should be working from a FOCOM side, what the FOCOM client needs to do then in order to use this interface. And then we can when we know that, then we can do the foundation. But perhaps we can do both in parallel.
Yeah, but I think, see, let's leave AutoIMS aside for the time being, okay? Let's talk Nephew only, okay? The foundation.
Yeah.
Does anyone disagree with what we have so far, right? So we call it infra Nephew, and we have parameter ref, and in that you can have generic information that you can use for clusters. Is there anyone against that? Let's first maybe agree on that, because I think we might have agreement there.
I'm trying to understand and what this would mean in whatever a client. Can I share a picture just so that I
yes,
follow?
Please go ahead.
Because
go ahead.
I try to update one page here. Just a moment. Where is the share?
And don't take what I've done as granted, right? It's just I'm trying to exemplify what we're discussing on the spot.
So if we keep it, okay, now I have kept AutoIMS here, but if we keep this this on this generic level, we say we would even move this one down then as a parameter ref. Then you have a number of such parameter refs. Then you have all of them have this cluster config kind. Then you have one myconfig1, another myconfig2, etc. In this list. In order to actually.
By the way, just to be specific, they don't all have to be cluster config, by the way. They can be other API versions as well, right?
Okay, so it's whatever. Parameter ref is completely, it doesn't specify.
So for example, if you see what we did for...
It's NCR. It's you can refer to NCR in parameter ref.
Yes. But so the client, the server basically tells you which one he supports. So you will be able to discover it, and the server will have a behavior based on them, right?
Okay. Okay. Still, then, if we say that in an AutoIMS case, we say that yeah, you can provide one or several cluster config, perhaps even only one, depending on what the template says. But the way of working then, if I get you right, is that you first would need to create that cluster config here. So FOCOM would need to send down and apply to create this myconfig1 CR, and then perhaps another myconfig2 CR, right? And then you would create the AutoIMS CR.
No,
is that correct?
No. So in the request for the cluster, you identify those cluster configs, the two that you have are part of your request.
But on the post, it's you mean you have an
They would already
in
exist.
the YAML file.
Wait,
They
so
would
so
already
first of all-
exist.
No,
First of
wait,
all, let's
exist
be
how?
clear at the moment. So for me, the cluster configs that we are talking about are things that's input that we use to create the cluster.
Yeah.
Correct. So it's generic input that is flexible, that is there to create a cluster. So in other words, that CR is not necessarily actuated on any cluster. Doesn't have to be. Right. So in other words, I look at how we, for example, do specialization today in for a network function, right? So we have, for example, an interface claim, we have a DNN claim, we have what else claim. So we have a bunch of claims. Actually they call requests, but so let's call them claims for now. They just live inside of at the moment a package. You could potentially use them as input, right? And then they never get actuated anywhere, but they are used to generate the NF deployment CR that eventually is going to be actuated onto the cluster. So in other words, these are, I would say, your inputs that can be used to customize your cluster creation.
Yeah. Right.
Wim,
But how
just
is that input
one-
provided then? I don't follow you. You say they will not be created. I mean, Fucom knows the IP address of cluster, the cluster, and then okay, here perhaps it's some other parameter. I used put IP address here as well. Fucom knows those input data. They need to be sent here, right? So
Yes,
how
yes.
are they coming down then? If you say, wouldn't you need to create this cluster config CRs, and how do you?
But that's an implementation again, right? So that
Okay.
depends on the implementation. Let's say you say, so Fucom selected an IP, okay? It comes down into one of these configs, right? Now, okay, so then it can be used to render, let's call it another CR that is the specific implementation for it that contains that IP address. Right? So it's not necessarily that CR that comes down, but it can be derived from the CR that you create another thing. But you could also create that CR directly as a one-to-one onto the cluster as well, right? So your operator has the logic to interpret that depending on the implementation with the template that it's rendering, right? So whether that operator or whatever that specialization function or whatever, how he uses it, it's the implementation that sits behind it, right? So it's not guaranteed that that CR has to be applied to the cluster first to do it. That's up to the implementation. You can use it just as an input to take in information that you are going to transform or mutate another CR that you can that you then apply to the cluster, or you can deploy it one-to-one. So you have the implementation that sits behind has the flexibility or takes the decision on how he's consuming it.
How would
But
Fucom know? It's not about consuming only. Fucom needs to provide this input somehow.
So if I go back to my original thing is I have a package, right? Your template. These parameters in my mind are schemas that are consumed as input. So you basically can discover that, right? So you know, if you want to give an IP address, here is a CR that actually you should say if you want to instantiate this template, right? So, and by doing so, the Fucom can actually discover
it. So my point here is that Fucom somehow Fucom would, I agree, would need to read the template and understand what to do. But do you say that if it can do different things, and how would it even know? And what else would it be if it's not creating a CR here called cluster config with IP address? What else would it do?
No,
What is
Fucom
the
doesn't care,
alternative?
right? Why does Fucom care what the receiving side does with it? Fucom,
how is Fucom sending it? I'm after the API here, right? We are talking about the OTMS interface here. Fucom need to send it via an API. That is the API we are trying to define here, right? We are not only
so I think what you're maybe missing is that your parameter ref that you have here, right, also contains that config, right? So it's not just the reference, it's actually the whole CR, it's embedded into that parameter ref.
Okay, that I missed. I thought this was just
No, 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 no,
a
no, no, no,
reference
no,
to
no.
something that is already existing.
No, you encapsulate that whole thing is basically encapsulating the CR.
That is not the way you showed it. Perhaps that is where I was lost then.
Okay,
So you say that here under, so it's actually under here you have spec and IP address.
Yeah, so
That
what
is a
happens
big
basically,
difference.
so what happens in NF deployment, for example, we actually encapsulate that that config inside of that CR, basically.
Okay.
But that's done through a KPT function, right? That's not done.
At the moment, yes, but you can, that's, yeah, so at the moment.
Exactly, it's automatic.
Yeah, that's an implementation choice, right? So that's a way to consume it, but I'm expecting
No,
that.
but I want to make sure that,
Yeah.
I want to make it clear because Stefan is really looking at the interface. So FOCOM, before sending the cluster claim, will have to go through maybe a KPT pipeline to do the,
Exactly.
don't have to.
Yeah.
No, you
But
don't have to, because that's an implementation, right? So you can have other ways to convey that information, right? So you could basically do a Java implementation.
But wait, we cannot have, the interface cannot be implementation specific. Whatever you do internally in FOCOM, yes, and internally in IMS, but we need to agree on one way how it is transferred over the line, right?
Correct. So, but and that's what the CR is about, right? So the Nepio infra type of thingy is doing that. So you have a bunch of parameter refs which are encapsulations of configs of other CRs that are represented as a list, basically.
Okay.
Hang on, I'm going to take an example. I'm just
we
trying
really
to
need an example on this. We would need an, if you have some example on the NF config, it would help a lot.
Give me 1 second.
I thought that it was an indirect or not, but a real reference. And not. Why is it even called parameter refs then?
So
because there is a reference. It's a KPT function that actually go and
okay,
and
still parameter
and
ref,
does.
is it still parameter ref, or is it in the meantime config ref? I don't. We changed it somehow.
Maybe it's config ref now. I don't. Okay.
But
Let me.
it's
I'm
still
going to
not
put
a
my. I have an
reference.
R2 instance.
Right.
There was a question, I think.
No, like this is not a reference, right? If you say that KPT inlines this configuration pieces before applying it to the management cluster, where it will be like in the end actuated, then the interface is whatever the result of the KPT pipeline is, and it is like a convenience function. If you want to, if you like your how to say KRM files disaggregated, and that's how it looks more manageable in Git for you, then that's fine. But that's not the interface specification, right?
Yeah,
because
so,
the KPT in this case will run in the FOCOM side,
wait,
or
so,
the whatever compiles this NF deployment together.
yeah, so now a KPT is a specific way to implement it, right? That's what we did so far in.
Sorry, implement what? I'm just trying to be very, very specific. I'm sorry, just like it seems we are getting lost on these details.
Yeah, so we are referring, so today what happens, right? So now this is very specific, by the way. We don't have to do it in this way for the cluster with for FOCOM at the end of the day, but towards, so let me take a step back why we did it that way, okay? First of all, so let's say what did we do? So we have a package, right? And in that package, what we have is we have an NF deployment, right? And then we have a way to specify additional configuration parameter snippets that are defined in that package, right? And we have a way to, so we're using KPT specialization right now to create a single CR, which is called NF deployment, that takes in these additional CRs together and encapsulates that in a single CR. The reason we did that is for the following reason. One is in the workload cluster, this allows us to avoid having to install all these specific config CRDs in the cluster to be able to, if you would not encapsulate them, you would have to create a CRD for each of them. And given that you don't know them ahead of time, and we wanted to have the flexibility, that was not an option. So the only way that we could make this work is by encapsulating into what the meta CR is. And as a result, what that allows us to do is actuate it without having to care inside of the workload cluster about all these CRDs or all these config snippets that are surrounding it, right? So the only person or the only entity that had to know it is the operator that consumes NF deployment, right? He needs to know, but the rest of the workload cluster doesn't, okay? Now, this API is a bit, so the behavior here is a bit different. So here we could do an encapsulation, or you can send them separate. So you have a choice here, because we are not actuating these inside of the cluster necessarily, but if you want to actuate them on a cluster, I would advocate to have the flexibility, because otherwise, for every config snippet that you need, you have to have a respective CRD inside of that management cluster or O2 cloud cluster that is able to have that schema there. Otherwise, you'll never be able to actuate that. Does that make? Is that
Okay, so what your example
Yes,
is now,
thank you very much.
to follow this, if you then assume that you have like some workload clusters that are like tailored for both Ericsson and Nokia RAN nodes, and then perhaps all of them needs Multus configuration. So then you have like a Multus configuration snippet that is in all those templates then, and then it's only one of them that needs something extra, and then that would be another configuration snippet that is only in that one. Is that the thinking, that you should be able then to build up your template using these building blocks, so to say?
See, I believe this gives you the most flexibility, right? Because then you only need to define your Multus API once, and everybody consumes them, whereas otherwise you have an overarching CR, right? API that you always have to change depending on every parameter that someone else needs.
Mm-hmm.
So the advantage of this is that Multus claim is once specified and everybody consumes it. And otherwise you have to change the Multus parameters you are interested in, and you have to then create APIs for each of them. So the advantage I see with that approach is you do not need to create new claims for Multus. We define it once and everybody can consume it.
Wait, but you're saying, okay, so, but maybe it's missing that we do have a cluster template. So like we already have a lot of the more or less hard-coded parameters already defined, right?
Yeah.
So we just need a fairly minimal set of parameters to be sent over, or one that is specific to the cluster template, right? Like that does not really, like, what I'm saying is that you like what you were saying, Wim, is that you want to have in the IMS management cluster a Multus config reference that any cluster claim can point to, if they wish. Yeah, is that a correct understanding of what you said, or you don't want to do that? You want to have.
I want you to give you the flexibility. So I didn't. Maybe I was too specific on the Multus thing. So then, so I do agree with you. It's always a chicken and egg, right? If you only want one parameter, why do I need to make it too flexible and stuff like that? But then tomorrow you need two parameters, and then you have to change your API and stuff like that. But with the system that we are defining, you can do either one, right? You can either build an overarching CR that abstracts all the details of these individual claims that will be specified, right? Eventually. Or you can basically segregate it or do something in the middle, right? So either of these options, I want to give you the choice to consume it however you want. I don't want to lock you in one way or another. You see?
Just one question about that. So I'm still trying to get what is the proposal. So you want to say that I can share, let's say, a multus config between multiple cluster claims, or you say that we should have we can have arbitrary config block sizes, but they should never be shared between, let's say, cluster claims. And
no. So let me clarify what I meant, right?
Mhm.
There will be a package for Multus, okay? And that has an API, okay? Now you have two options, okay? Let's make it simple. We have a Multus API, a package with an API for a Multus claim, if you will, right? And you have a cluster claim, okay? Which is O2IMS, let's call it, right? Now you have two options. You can either create a cluster claim for Nefio, which contains the O2IMS cluster claim and the Multus cluster claim, right? And you can share that claim across multiple clusters because you can reuse it potentially. Or you can define a single cluster claim for O2IMS that includes some Multus parameters. And you only specify one config ref or one configuration, and you basically avoid the Multus, and your operator renders whatever Multus needs, and he knows what to do with it. But towards FOCOM, you can either specify one or two things, if I make that clearer. Does that clarify? I don't want you to say you can only do one or the other. You can only do one thing. You can do however you want it.
Okay, just one. You said again, like, I'm trying to understand. You said that a cluster claim can be reused for multiple clusters, but the cluster claim is more or less a request for a very specific, like for one single cluster, right? We can have maybe configuration pieces that are used, let's say the multus config or something like that, that's included in this parameter ref, but not the cluster claim. That should never be reused.
Agree. Sorry, I was.
Okay, yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah, but it can refer to the same template, but with other parameters and stuff like that. Yeah. I agree with you. There has to be something specific, otherwise you create the same thing again. Yeah.
Okay, so then you're saying that config snippets can be shared, and that can be, let's say, a way to ad absurdum implement the cluster template itself. But that's okay. That's beside the point. Okay, I get it now. Thank you very much.
I just think we should. I wonder really. So we mean the same when we say shared, Greg. I think the sharing is more of like the custom resource definition and not the actual values, the configuration values. The configuration values could still be unique for every cluster instance, but all of them share the need for having multus configuration. So the fact that the CR is there, the template says that, yeah, I need input for this multus CR. That gives you a way, as I see it, from the template to tell FOCOM that, yeah, you need to provide me this input. And then that is more of a common CR definition then for the multus configuration. And then you can have another common CR definition for the Calico configuration, etc. And then in your template, you tell them, yeah, I need input data for this list of configurations.
Yes. So, yeah, like what you can have is like have a cluster template that describes a set of configuration snippets, CRs. Like it says that, okay, I need one multus config, I need one whatever, like, well, I need one multus config. That's all that it wants to have. It doesn't care about anything. But then what I think Wim was saying is that whenever you want to build this thing, actually, then you can either inline this one or create a new multus config or reuse something that is shared across like that is just there by the IMS. So what I understood that right, that like you cannot just define like cluster templates, but also predefine configuration snippets, shared configuration snippets for inputs into cluster templates. Maybe I'm getting that from Wim,
Yeah.
but
so Gurley, just because let me reply to what Alec put into the chat, right? So I want to define our API, and I'm talking about the baseline inside of Nephew, right? As a flexible way to include multiple references, okay? Now you have a choice, right? If you want to hide all of these details to the consumer, you can, okay? So you could define an O2IMS implementation that only has one parameter ref. And with that one parameter ref, you do everything, right? But I don't want the Nephew API to be restrictive to that. I want the Nephew workload cluster claim to be flexible, to have multiple parameter refs that can be added to it, however people want to please people.
So should we proceed like
so in
this
other
then?
words, if you want just
I
one,
think we need to have two layers here then. You want this generic Nephew cluster claim. I think we need to define an O2IMS custom resource on top of that one then. So we need, it will be two layers.
Yeah, that's a pity, but yeah.
I think that is... Otherwise, you cannot combine this, right? We would like to have O2IMS that is Nephew agnostic, and we would have a Nephew that is more generic than O2IMS.
Yes. Yeah, but yeah, so what you do in O2IMS, I don't care, but I want the Nephew to have the flexible system.
Yeah, I understand.
I don't want to be constrained to what we do for O2IMS.
Hmm.
So we have 10 minutes to go, and I'm not very clear anymore what is on the table as a proposal for a design here. So I'm going to stop. Maybe, I don't know, Stefan, if your screen, you have the latest thoughts captured, but I'm a bit lost right now on what would be our way forward, because I started thinking about this, and I don't know. I mean, we want to make the request from FOCOM to IMS as straightforward as possible. And I'm starting thinking having this should be embedded now as part of the cluster claim. That's what we said ultimately, or we could have it embedded, or we couldn't have it embedded. It's up to us.
I'm sharing, right? So when you
Oh,
say
go ahead.
this, do you point to?
Sorry. I was sharing as well. I'm looking at your screen now. It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you have here, I think, is clear to me. And parameter ref.
So we
Yeah,
say
but then
now
all of a
then
sudden I failed to see the value of having a parameter ref if it's defined in the CR itself. Now I failed to understand that value here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just shared the
Because I thought-
document actually with what we actually implemented for NF deploy, which is actually,
Yeah, which I understand, but that I understand.
and that's
That I understand.
Yeah.
It's externalized, so the param are externalized in that config file. Whereas, but then begs the question Stefan was asking is, now FOCOM all of a sudden needs to create that config file before it creates the cluster claim.
So
at the same time, we're saying this config file is not a CRD, it's more of a meta CR. So it's never going to actuate in the cluster. So how does it get carried over the interface?
Yeah. And here in this example, it's still strange because here it is a reference the way I understood it from the beginning. I mean, here you have parameter ref kind name, and then nothing more. And then the actual values is here now then inside here, right?
What happens
So-
is this, right? So what happens is in the package, right? So the one that encapsulates it is actually it happens through specialization, right? But what actually gets sent down to the cluster is actually the encapsulated thing within the meta CR. That's what gets sent down to the cluster. And the reason we do that is that if you would send them as two separate CR, you have to actuate the CRD for the cellular config cellular blah 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 in the workload cluster, and we don't do that.
Exactly,
So-
that defeats the purpose.
Yeah, so in other words, the way you would implement this with O2IMS, right, is you actually send that meta CR, right, with the encapsulated objects down on the interface.
I follow
So
that,
it's not-
but I feel that is more of an internal, it would be an IMS internal optimization in order to avoid creating additional CRs in the IMS management cluster. I don't think this parameter is not suitable for defining how you send things over the O2IMS interface.
Why not? This is a standard
What?
CRD, by the way.
Because there you will not have any value of this parameter ref. You will still, in the end, this is the spec data that you still will send down here.
Yeah,
So
correct. So this there's nothing. I mean, this is a generic CR, right? So if you look to NF deployment, it's a generic CR. That so a CRD allows you to specify this encapsulation. It calls row extension, runtime row extension, allows you to specify a CRD with that encap capability.
I can understand it if we go back to if this provides us with a way to have a number of such snippets, then a configuration snippet in your OCloud cluster template, and then you can also attach the validation schemas to each of those pieces. And then FOCOM needs to still take, it needs still to understand each of those configuration snippets, and then render them together then in the cluster claim request beneath here.
Yeah.
It could also do some pre-validation then based on the schema that is defined for each config.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. But I think still it needs to be then, it needs to be queried up to FOCOM, and FOCOM needs to have this awareness of that, there are a number of configuration pieces. I wonder if we will get acceptance in ORAN that FOCOM shall work like that, because it's a quite specific way of working then, a bit kept related even.
No, this has nothing to do with kept, guys.
It's not.
Let's forget kept out of this. This is just how I could give you a Go or a Python or a Java or a JavaScript implementation that doesn't say. The only thing that kept does, it basically, there is a function that we wrote that does the encapsulation, but it has nothing to do with kept. Let's not, that's not a valid argument.
Yeah, okay, I mean, it's okay for us. We are aiming to use kept, so I don't see, I'm just worried about, are we into declaring very low level, okay, how FOCOM shall behave, because we want to have this an OCloud cluster template that has these configuration snippets, or is it okay? Is it something we can get accepted in ORAN?
See, the
Well, we don't
advantage
need to specify.
so here is, if I may quickly, Alexis, sorry. The advantage that I see is the following, Stefan, right? So, okay, so let's say you go with an abstract CRD, okay? Let's say you are not, so let's say you specify one of these snippets, right? Which is O2IMS cluster claim, which is encapsulated, okay? And now tomorrow you need another parameter, or you need a bunch of other parameters that are needed, and someone has already defined the config for it. So you have two options. Either you change your API with the parameters that you need. So you basically extend your API that you had before, and you embed the parameter, or you basically encapsulate the additional parameters with a CR that someone already defined, and you are good to go. You don't have to change it. That's the flexibility you get.
But that you can still do with the high-level abstracted CR, Wim, like the cluster claim. the cluster claim is just referencing the, let's say, in this case, the NF deployment, which again has a meta CI CR as the config, right? Which is, and you can still extend those CRs, right? Internally,
But
within
you're
the
changing your API. So that means you have to change the client, you have to change the server. So you have to, there's a bunch of stuff that that has to change when you do that. With the system that I expose, you don't. No change in the API. API stays stable. You just encapsulate and embed more objects. That's the
No, but
difference.
the API still call the same reference. I don't see why the API has to be changed with new
Well, even if the
parameters.
reference changed, you change the API, right? You have to do an upgrade, you have to do validation rule, you have to do conversions, all of that stuff.
But that stands true in case you are extending the manifest the way you are like proposing that I don't know.
change
Maybe
the
I'm
API. The API doesn't change.
No, but yeah, the idea is that the claim itself has a different life cycle than the config element, and the config at runtime gets populated or introduced into the cluster claim CR, but it's only at runtime. So if you change your config at design time, the API or the cluster claim doesn't change. You can add as many parameter day 2 for the cluster config. It has its own life cycle, independent of cluster claim life cycle. And the runtime will make the embedding of the cluster config as part of the cluster claim. So it's more of a runtime kind of versus design time kind of thing. You only design it once, the cluster claim with its integration with a cluster config as depicted here. But here, remove the spec IP address. It wouldn't be there. The runtime will populate the spec here based on what the cluster config spec is. So if today it's IP address, then it's IP address. If tomorrow it's IP address plus 3 other fields, then it's IP address plus 3 other fields. But from a FOCOM API standpoint, that API doesn't change regardless the life cycle of a cluster config CR.
Yeah, but
I think that's the
but-
intent.
yeah, I understand that, but now wearing the hat of the ORAN, I don't see that fits the purpose or the discussions that we are having there, right? I understand the trade-offs, right, of having abstracted CR, but I think that has its own significance to bring the agnosticity, which maybe has to deal with this design time changes versus the dynamicity you wanted to bring, because that's
Well, it's
Yeah.
and that's the trade-off, I think, and we're gonna have to wrap it up, but that's always the same trade-off. Like, how much do we want to standardize versus how much versus how little? And right now the proposal is we have like the property bag. It's different. It's a parameter ref in this case. We have a way to say whatever you want to we standardize the way to inject config, but that config doesn't need to be standardized. That's what we're saying here.
I
But
think
look-
that then we need to proceed on 2 tracks here then. I would still see a need to proceed with more concrete O2IMS ORAN interface, the way we should standardize it, and how that one would then basically be put on top of this cluster claim CR.
Because the
look,
moment-
gents, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I got to run because I'm 2 minutes late to my
We wrap
next
up.
meeting. So
I think we have
need-
made some progress. We need to continue.
yeah, we'll we'll have to schedule another one of these.
Yeah. This is important. Yeah.
Or
Okay.
Tim, you'll let us know if you can use your hour Wednesday. Else we'll schedule another
Yeah,
one of these.
I'm allocating 25 minutes, right, to you guys, just to let you know, right? And I'll keep that going, but I've got to
Okay.
do some other work in there as well for some other pieces of it. If you
Yeah.
need
That makes
these
sense.
blocks are helpful. I would suggest that you schedule another 2 hours to get your
So
design
let's
down.
talk Wednesday, and let's take a decision Wednesday on the next.
Works for me.
Maybe.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
All right,
you
thanks, guys.
everyone
Thanks,
for
Paul.
joining.
Yeah.
Have a good
Thank you.
rest of the week.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Alexis. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
everyone.
Bye.